The morning briefing room fell silent when Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun walked through the doors. Officers who had been chatting loudly about weekend plans suddenly found her coffee cups fascinating. The silence was not one of respect, but of barely concealed doubt. At 34, Sarah was the youngest person ever appointed to command the 2nd Tactical Response Battalion. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor had earned her the nickname Mouse among some of the more traditional officers. They whispered that her promotion was a diversity hire, that she had never seen real combat, that when the pressure mounted, she would crumble. Sarah had heard the whispers. She had read the reports questioning her appointment. The media had been particularly harsh, with one military analyst calling her selection a dangerous experiment in political correctness. But she had also read something else: the weather forecast for the next 72 hours. Hurricane Patricia was building strength in the Atlantic, and current projections showed it making landfall near Coastal City, where nearly 200,000 civilians lived in the potential impact zone. The storm was already being called a once-in-a-generation weather event, with winds projected to reach 180 miles per hour. During the briefing, General Morrison outlined the situation. Patricia was still 3 days away, but evacuation orders had been issued for the entire coastal region. The National Guard was mobilizing, and multiple military units were being positioned for disaster response. Sarah's battalion was assigned to support operations, military speak for staying out of the way while more experienced commanders handled the real work. Major Richards, a 20-year veteran with 3 combat deployments, leaned back in his chair as the general spoke. He had been passed over for the battalion command that went to Sarah, and his resentment was obvious to everyone in the room. Supporting operations, he muttered just loud enough for others to hear. Probably for the best. But Sarah was not listening to Richard's commentary. She was studying the meteorological data with the intensity of a chess master analyzing her opponent's next move. Something about the storm's behavior patterns was bothering her. The hurricane was following a predicted path, but several atmospheric indicators suggested the models might be wrong. That evening, Sarah worked alone in her office while most of the base settled into their pre-deployment routines. She had called in favors with meteorologists at 3 different weather services, spoken with hurricane hunters who had flown through Patricia's eye, and reviewed historical data on similar storms from the past 50 years. The official forecast showed Patricia making landfall as a Category 4 hurricane, with the eye passing about 20 miles east of Coastal City. Destructive, certainly, but manageable with proper preparation. However, Sarah's analysis suggested something different. A high-pressure system moving in from the west was likely to stall Patricia's forward momentum while simultaneously intensifying the storm. When Sarah tried to share her concerns with General Morrison, she was politely dismissed. The National Weather Service was using the most advanced computer models available, she was told. Military commanders should focus on following orders, not playing meteorologist. But Sarah could not shake the feeling that everyone was preparing for the wrong storm. She spent the second night creating contingency plans that nobody had asked for, mapping evacuation routes that no one thought would be needed, and identifying critical infrastructure points that might require emergency attention. Her aide, Sergeant Martinez, found her still working at 0300 hours. "Colonel, you should get some sleep," he said quietly. "Long day ahead." Sarah looked up from her maps and charts. "Sergeant, what do you know about the 1938 New England hurricane?" Martinez blinked, clearly not expecting a history lesson at 3 in the morning. "Can't say I know much about it, ma'am." "It was supposed to be a minor storm when it hit the coast," Sarah explained. Weather forecasters predicted it would weaken and move harmlessly out to sea. Instead, it stalled, intensified, and killed over 600 people because no one was prepared for what actually happened. She pointed to the tracking charts spread across her desk. "Patricia is showing similar patterns. The computer models are good, but they cannot account for every variable. And if I am right, then 200,000 people are about to face something much worse than anyone expects." Martinez studied his commander's face. In the months since she had taken command, he had learned to trust her instincts. She had a way of seeing details that others missed, of connecting pieces that seemed unrelated. What do you want to do, Colonel? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Making preparations based on her analysis would require resources, personnel, and equipment that had been allocated for other purposes. If she was wrong, she would look like a paranoid commander second-guessing her superiors. If she was right, but did nothing, people would die. Start making some calls, she said finally, quietly. I want to know the exact location and status of every piece of heavy equipment we have access to. I want communication links established with every emergency service within a 100-mile radius of Coastal City. And I want detailed maps of every evacuation shelter and medical facility in the region. As Martinez left to begin making the calls, Sarah returned to her analysis. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up as Patricia's outer bands approached the coast. The storm was still more than 24 hours away, but Sarah could feel it coming like a migraine building behind her eyes. The next morning brought the first real test of Sarah's leadership. During the final briefing before deployment, Colonel Williams from the 5th Engineering Battalion questioned the positioning of Sarah's unit. "Seems like the mouse is jumping at shadows," he said with a smirk. "Patricia is going to hit 20 miles east. No need to panic." Several officers chuckled, but Sarah noticed that General Morrison was watching her carefully. She had worked with Morrison before, and while he had not supported her promotion initially, he respected competence when he saw it. "Sir, if I may," Sarah said calmly, "I would like to recommend shifting our positioning about 15 miles west and having additional helicopters on standby. Current weather models may be underestimating the storm's western drift." The room fell silent. Colonel Williams shook his head. "This is exactly what I was worried about. Commander thinks she knows better than the National Weather Service." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I think we should be prepared for multiple scenarios, sir. That is what good commanders do." General Morrison studied the maps for a moment. "Colonel Chun, you are going to position your battalion according to your analysis. If you are wrong, we will have a conversation about following orders. If you are right—" He paused, looking around the room. "If you're right, then maybe some people in this room need to start paying closer attention to their junior officers." As the meeting broke up, Sarah felt the weight of every skeptical gaze in the room. She had just bet her career on a weather forecast that contradicted every official prediction. In less than 24 hours, Hurricane Patricia would reveal whether the quiet commander they had all dismissed was actually the one person who truly understood what was coming. Dawn broke gray and ominous as Sarah's battalion moved into position 15 miles west of where every other unit was deployed. The wind was already gusting to 40 miles per hour, and the air had that electric quality that came before major storms. Patricia was still 8 hours from landfall, but Sarah could feel the hurricane's presence like a living thing stalking the coast. Her radio crackled with updates from other commanders, most of whom were settling into positions based on the official forecast. Colonel Williams had made a show of deploying his engineering units exactly where the Weather Service recommended, taking every opportunity to emphasize that he was following orders rather than chasing hunches. But Sarah was not chasing hunches. She was following evidence that most people were too busy or too proud to examine closely. Throughout the morning, she received updates from her network of contacts in meteorology. A hurricane hunter pilot reported unexpected wind shear patterns. An oceanographer noted unusual wave formations, suggesting the storm was fighting competing pressure systems. A retired Weather Service forecaster, who had studied the 1938 hurricane extensively, called to say that Patricia's behavior was remarkably similar to that historic storm. By noon, the first signs appeared that Sarah's analysis might be correct. Patricia's forward speed had decreased from 12 miles per hour to 8, while the storm's intensity had increased to Category 5 status. More concerning, the hurricane's western edge was bulging outward, suggesting the storm was growing larger even as it slowed down. Sarah was coordinating with local emergency services when Sergeant Martinez approached with a concerned expression. "Colonel, we are getting reports that the civilian evacuation is not going as planned. Traffic jams on the main highways, some shelters already overcrowded, and a lot of people who decided to ride out the storm in their homes. The evacuation had been based on the official forecast, which showed most of Coastal City being spared the worst of Patricia's fury. But if Sarah was right about the storm's true path, then thousands of people were in the wrong places preparing for the wrong disaster. "Give me a direct line to emergency management," Sarah ordered. "And I want real-time traffic updates from the State Highway Patrol." Within minutes, Sarah was speaking with Rebecca Martinez, the county's emergency management director. Rebecca sounded exhausted and overwhelmed. "Colonel, we have got chaos out here. The highways are parking lots. We have got 3 shelters that are already full, and the latest forecast still shows the storm passing us to the east." "Rebecca, I need you to listen carefully," Sarah said. "I believe the storm is going to stall and shift west. If I am right, Coastal City is going to take a direct hit in about 6 hours." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Colonel, with all due respect, I cannot contradict the National Weather Service. I've got 200,000 people counting on official information." Sarah understood Rebecca's position, but she also knew what was about to happen. "I'm not asking you to contradict anyone. I'm asking you to prepare for a worst-case scenario. What would you need if Patricia did hit the city directly?" Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah and Rebecca developed a contingency plan that could be activated quickly if the storm shifted. Additional shelters would be opened in sturdy buildings west of the city. Emergency supplies would be positioned for rapid deployment. Medical facilities would be placed on highest alert status. "I can prepare for this quietly," Rebecca said finally. "But if you are wrong, Colonel, if I am wrong, then some extra supplies get moved around for no reason," Sarah replied. "If I am right, we might save thousands of lives." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's predictions became increasingly accurate. Patricia continued to slow and intensify, with the western edge of the storm expanding toward Coastal City. At 1,500 hours, the National Weather Service issued its first revision, acknowledging that the hurricane might impact areas previously thought to be safe. But the revision was too little, too late. The official forecast still showed Patricia as a Category 4 storm passing east of the city. Sarah's analysis suggested a Category 5 hurricane making direct landfall in less than 4 hours. General Morrison called personally at 1,600 hours. "Colonel, your positioning is looking prescient. What is your assessment?" Sarah looked at her latest data. Patricia's I was now projected to pass directly over Coastal City at approximately 2,000 hours. Wind speeds had increased to 185 miles per hour, making this one of the strongest hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. "Sir, we are looking at a catastrophic event. The storm is going to be stronger and more westward than anyone anticipated. We need to implement emergency protocols immediately." "What do you need?" For the first time since taking command, Sarah felt like someone was truly listening to her analysis rather than dismissing it. "I need authorization to coordinate directly with emergency services. I need every helicopter we can get airborne before the winds get too strong. And I need permission to move our units into positions for immediate search and rescue operations." "Done. You have operational control of disaster response in Sector 7. Do not make me regret this decision, Colonel." As Sarah coordinated her battalion's final preparations, she could see other military units scrambling to adjust their positions. Colonel Williams was frantically trying to move his engineering equipment westward, but much of it was too heavy to relocate quickly. Major Richards was arguing over radio frequencies about evacuation routes that he had insisted would never be needed. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the officers who had questioned her preparedness were now desperately trying to catch up to a situation she had been planning for since the storm was first detected. At 1,730 hours, the first hurricane-force winds reached Coastal City. Sarah's battalion was positioned and ready. Emergency shelters that Rebecca had quietly prepared were receiving last-minute evacuees. Medical teams that Sarah had coordinated with were standing by in secure locations. But even with all the preparation, Sarah knew that the next few hours would test everyone beyond their limits. Patricia was not just a hurricane anymore. It was a monster storm unlike anything anyone had experienced. The quiet commander that everyone had dismissed was about to face the ultimate test of leadership with 200,000 lives hanging in the balance. As the wind howled outside her command post, Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Radio communications with all emergency services were functioning. Supply lines were secured. Personnel were in position for immediate deployment once the storm passed. The woman they had called Mouse was about to show them what real leadership looked like when everything fell apart at once. At 1945 hours, Hurricane Patricia's eye wall slammed into Coastal City with the force of a freight train made of wind and water. Sarah's command post, located in a reinforced building 12 miles inland, shook like it was caught in an earthquake. Outside, the wind screamed at 190 miles per hour, turning everyday objects into deadly projectiles. The first reports came in immediately, and they were worse than even Sarah had anticipated. The storm surge was 22 feet high, flooding downtown Coastal City with billions of gallons of seawater. Entire neighborhoods that had been considered safe were disappearing under the black water. Power grids failed across 3 counties. Cell phone towers toppled like matchsticks. "Colonel, we have lost contact with emergency management," Sergeant Martinez reported, shouting over the noise of the storm battering their building. Rebecca Martinez's command center took a direct hit from debris. "We do not know her status." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Rebecca had been coordinating civilian evacuation efforts from a building that was supposed to be hurricane-proof. If the emergency management center was down, then thousands of people were trapped without coordination or communication. "Switch all emergency frequencies to military channels," Sarah ordered. "We are now the primary coordination center for disaster response. Give me direct contact with every fire department, police station, and hospital that still has power." Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah's command post became the nerve center for an entire region's survival. Police chiefs called in requesting evacuation assistance for flooded stations. Hospital administrators reported that their emergency generators were failing. Fire departments were trapped in their own buildings by rising water. But Sarah had prepared for exactly this scenario. While other commanders had positioned their units based on the assumption that civilian authorities would handle coordination, Sarah had spent weeks building relationships with local emergency services and creating backup communication networks. Martinez, activate the emergency supply cache at Riverside High School. Get the medical teams to St. Mary's Hospital. Their backup power just failed, and they have got dozens of patients on life support. And I want 2 helicopter crews airborne the moment this wind drops below 50 miles per hour. The hurricanes I passed directly over Coastal City at 20-30 hours, creating an eerie calm that lasted exactly 43 minutes. Sarah knew this was her window. While the storm's backside would bring more devastating winds, these 43 minutes were the only opportunity for rescue operations. "All units, this is command. We have eyes on multiple situations requiring immediate response. Fire Station 7 has 17 people trapped on the roof by floodwater. Mercy Hospital has lost all power with critical patients. And we have reports of a school bus that overturned on Highway 9 with children still inside." Sarah's voice was calm and precise as she coordinated 3 simultaneous rescue operations. The months of planning, the careful positioning of resources, and the backup system she had insisted on implementing were all paying off now. Lieutenant Torres, piloting the first helicopter to launch, reported what he saw from above. "Command, this is worse than anything we trained for. The entire downtown is underwater. I can see people on rooftops, but some of those buildings do not look stable." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, calculating odds and resources. Every decision she made in the next few minutes would determine who lived and who died. The pressure was enormous, but it was also clarifying. This was why she had become a soldier, not for the politics or recognition, but for moments when competent leadership meant the difference between catastrophe and survival. "Torres, priority rescue at coordinates 34.7651, minus 76.9325. That is Riverside Nursing Home. 68 elderly residents, some on oxygen that will fail when their generators run out of fuel. Martinez, get our backup power unit to St. Mary's Hospital immediately." Jackson, take Team Alpha to Highway 9 for the school bus recovery. As Sarah's teams deployed across the disaster zone, reports started coming in from other military units. Colonel Williams' engineering battalion was trapped by flooding, their heavy equipment useless in the current conditions. Major Richards had lost contact with half his personnel when their temporary command post was destroyed by a falling radio tower. But the most telling report came from General Morrison himself. Colonel Chun, this is Morrison. I am getting reports that your battalion is the only unit effectively responding to the disaster. What is your status? Sarah looked around her command post, where 24 personnel were coordinating rescue operations across 50 square miles of devastation. Every phone line was active, every radio channel was managing life or death situations, and every piece of equipment was being used to its maximum capacity. Sir, we are operational and coordinating emergency response for the entire affected region. We have teams deployed at 17 locations, with 2 more helicopter crews launching as soon as the winds permit. How the hell did you manage to stay operational when everyone else is dealing with basic survival? The answer was simple, though Sarah did not want to sound like she was criticizing her fellow officers. We prepared for the storm that actually happened, sir, not the one we hoped would happen. As Hurricane Patricia's backside brought another wave of destructive winds, Sarah's teams continued their work. They rescued 37 people from flooded homes, restored power to 2 critical care facilities, and evacuated 150 residents from a nursing home whose building was starting to collapse. But the most dramatic rescue came at 2,200 hours, when Lieutenant Torres reported a school bus hanging off a collapsed bridge with 12 children trapped inside. The bus was dangling 40 feet above a raging river, held in place by a single twisted guardrail. Command, we need a miracle here, Torres radioed. The bus is moving every time the wind hits it. I do not think the guardrail will hold much longer. Sarah coordinated a complex rescue involving 2 helicopters, a tactical rappelling team, and precise timing to extract the children before the bus fell into the water. The operation took 18 minutes that felt like 18 hours, but all 12 children were brought to safety. As the hurricane finally moved inland and began to weaken, Sarah allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. Her battalion had coordinated the rescue of over 400 people, maintained communication networks when official systems failed, and kept critical infrastructure operating during the worst natural disaster in the region's history. The radio crackled with a message from General Morrison. Colonel Chun, preliminary reports indicate that your unit's response prevented what could have been thousands of casualties. I want a full briefing as soon as conditions permit. Sarah looked out at the devastation visible through her command post windows. Coastal City would take years to rebuild. The economic damage would be measured in billions of dollars. But because one quiet commander had refused to accept conventional wisdom about storm forecasting, the human cost had been far less than anyone had feared possible. The woman they had dismissed as inexperienced was about to become the most respected disaster response commander in military history. But Sarah was not thinking about recognition or career advancement. She was already planning recovery operations and wondering how many other disasters could be prevented by leaders who were willing to prepare for the worst-case scenario rather than hoping for the best. Dawn revealed the true scope of Hurricane Patricia's destruction. Coastal City looked like a war zone, with entire blocks reduced to rubble and debris scattered for miles inland. The storm surge had pushed boats 6 miles from the ocean, left cars wrapped around trees, and created a landscape that would have been unrecognizable to residents just 24 hours earlier. But in the midst of this devastation, Sarah's command post was a beacon of organized activity. While other military units were still assessing damage to their own equipment and personnel, Sarah's battalion was already deep into recovery operations. The careful planning and resource positioning that had seemed excessive to some observers was now proving invaluable. Sarah had managed only 2 hours of sleep, but she felt alert and focused as she reviewed overnight reports. Her teams had established 3 emergency medical stations, restored communication links to isolated communities, and begun clearing critical transportation routes. Most importantly, casualty reports were far lower than anyone had predicted. At 0630 hours, General Morrison arrived by helicopter with a full inspection team. Sarah met him at the landing zone, noting the shocked expressions on the faces of officers who were seeing the destruction for the first time. "Colonel Chun, I need to understand how your unit maintained operational capacity when everything else fell apart," Morrison said without preamble. "I have got 3 colonels who cannot even communicate with their own troops, and you are running disaster relief for half the state." Sarah led the inspection team through her command post, explaining the preparation that had begun 3 days earlier. The backup communication systems that everyone had considered redundant. The resource caches positioned based on worst-case projections rather than official forecasts. The relationships built with local emergency services before the crisis began. "Sir, the difference was not superior equipment or larger personnel numbers," Sarah explained. "The difference was accepting that official predictions might be wrong and preparing accordingly. We planned for the storm that could happen, not just the storm we expected to happen." Colonel Williams, who had arrived with the inspection team, looked uncomfortable as he listened to Sarah's briefing. His engineering battalion was still trying to locate equipment that had been swept away by flooding, while Sarah's units were actively rebuilding critical infrastructure. "You got lucky, Chun," Williams said defensively. "Nobody could have predicted Patricia would behave the way it did." Sarah turned to face Williams directly. "Sir, with respect, I did predict it. 3 days ago, the meteorological data was available to anyone who took time to analyze it properly. The difference was not luck, it was preparation." General Morrison studied the operational charts that covered Sarah's command post walls. Every rescue operation, every resource deployment, and every communication link was documented with military precision. "Colonel, walk me through your decision-making process. I want to understand how you managed to coordinate 17 simultaneous operations while other units were losing contact with their own personnel." Over the next hour, Sarah demonstrated the command structure she had developed specifically for disaster response scenarios. Unlike traditional military operations that relied on vertical communication hierarchies, Sarah had created a network system that allowed direct coordination between field teams and emergency services. Traditional command structures work well for conventional military operations, Sarah explained, but disaster response requires rapid adaptation and horizontal communication. We needed to be able to respond to changing situations without waiting for approval through multiple command levels. The inspection team watched as Sarah's personnel coordinated with civilian authorities, managed resource distribution, and adapted to new emergency reports in real time. It was unlike any military operation they had observed before, but it was clearly effective. Lieutenant Torres approached with an update that demonstrated the scope of Sarah's operation. "Colonel, we have completed evacuation of Riverside District. That makes 347 people relocated to secure shelters since the storm passed. Medical teams report no fatalities in our operational area, and we have restored power to 6 critical facilities." General Morrison looked impressed despite himself. "Colonel Chun, what was the casualty count in your sector?" Sarah consulted her status board. 17 injuries requiring hospitalization, 3 missing persons that we are still searching for, and no confirmed fatalities. For an area that included 40,000 residents in the direct impact zone, we consider that an exceptional outcome. The numbers were remarkable, especially when compared to reports coming in from other sectors. Areas that had been considered safer based on the original forecast were reporting significantly higher casualties because they had been less prepared for the actual storm that hit. Colonel Williams studied the casualty reports with obvious discomfort. His sector, which had been positioned based on official weather predictions, was reporting 12 fatalities and 67 serious injuries. "These numbers do not make sense," he muttered. "Chen's area took the worst direct hit, but somehow has the lowest casualties." "The numbers make perfect sense," Sarah replied calmly. "We prepared for a worst-case scenario and positioned resources accordingly. When that worst-case scenario actually occurred, we were ready." General Morrison spent another 2 hours observing Sarah's operation before requesting a private briefing. In a quiet corner of the command post, he asked the question that had been bothering him since arriving. "Colonel, I have to ask, how did a commander with no disaster response experience manage to outperform officers with decades of field experience?" Sarah had been expecting this question. "Sir, disaster response is not about experience with previous disasters. It is about preparation for disasters that have never happened before. Experience can actually be a disadvantage if it makes you assume that future events will resemble past events." She pointed to the meteorological data that still covered her workstation. Every experienced commander in this operation prepared for hurricanes they had seen before. "I prepared for the hurricane that the data suggested was actually coming." The difference was not experience. It was willingness to challenge assumptions. General Morrison nodded slowly. "Colonel, I am recommending you for immediate promotion to full colonel and assignment as Regional Disaster Response Coordinator. Your performance during this operation has been extraordinary." Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she was already thinking about improvements for future operations. "Sir, I would prefer to focus on developing training protocols based on what we learned during Patricia. If we can systematize this approach to disaster preparation, other commanders will not have to recreate these procedures from scratch." As the inspection team prepared to leave, Sarah returned to coordinating recovery operations. There were still communities without power, families separated by the storm, and infrastructure that needed immediate attention. The hurricane was over, but the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. By evening, reports were coming in from across the disaster zone that highlighted the effectiveness of Sarah's approach. Areas under her coordination were already seeing restored services and organized recovery efforts. Communities that had seemed completely devastated were beginning to function again because Sarah had prepared for exactly this type of comprehensive disaster. The quiet commander who had been dismissed as inexperienced had proven that effective leadership was not about following conventional wisdom, but about having the courage to prepare for realities that others preferred to ignore. Hurricane Patricia had revealed who was truly ready to lead when everything fell apart at once. 6 months after Hurricane Patricia, Sarah Chun stood before a congressional committee investigating disaster response failures. The hearing room was packed with media, military officials, and family members of storm victims. What had started as an inquiry into military preparedness had evolved into something much larger, a fundamental examination of how leadership was evaluated and developed. The committee chairman, Senator Roberts, opened with questions that Sarah had expected. How had one battalion commander managed to coordinate effective disaster response when larger, more experienced units had failed? How had casualty rates in her sector been 90% lower than in comparable areas? How had someone with no disaster response experience outperformed officers with decades of field training? "Senator, I believe the premise of your question contains an assumption that may be incorrect," Sarah replied calmly. "You ask how someone with no experience succeeded where experienced officers failed. But I would suggest that conventional experience was actually a disadvantage during Hurricane Patricia." Senator Roberts looked puzzled. "Could you explain what you mean by that, Colonel?" Sarah had spent months refining her analysis of what had happened during Patricia, studying after-action reports from every unit involved in the response. The patterns were clear to her now, though they challenged basic assumptions about military leadership development. "Sir, every experienced disaster response officer prepared for hurricanes they had encountered before. They positioned resources based on historical patterns, relied on official forecasts that reflected average storm behavior, and implemented procedures designed for typical disaster scenarios. But Patricia was not a typical storm." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Experience can create blind spots when it leads to assumptions about what will happen next. Officers with extensive disaster experience were confident in their preparation because they had successfully managed similar situations before. But confidence based on past experience can be dangerous when facing unprecedented events. The committee room fell silent as Sarah continued. "I succeeded not because I had more experience, but because I had less confidence in conventional predictions. When official forecasts said the storm would pass 20 miles east, I prepared for it to hit directly. When protocols called for standard positioning, I positioned for worst-case scenarios. When experienced officers were confident in their preparation, I was worried that our preparation was inadequate. Senator Martinez, who represented the coastal region that Patricia had devastated, leaned forward in her chair. Colonel Chun, are you saying that inexperience was actually an advantage during this disaster? No, Senator. I am saying that intellectual humility was an advantage. The willingness to question official predictions, to prepare for scenarios that seemed unlikely, and to admit that conventional wisdom might be wrong. These are not functions of experience or inexperience. They're functions of how you approach problem solving. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Sarah explaining in detail how her battalion had managed to save hundreds of lives through careful preparation and adaptive response. But the most significant moment came when Senator Roberts asked about the broader implications for military leadership development. Colonel, based on your experience with Hurricane Patricia, what changes would you recommend to how we select and train military commanders? Sarah had been thinking about this question for months. Senator, I would recommend that we evaluate commanders based on their ability to prepare for low-probability, high-impact events rather than their experience managing routine operations. The most dangerous military situations are not the ones we have faced before. They're the ones we have never imagined. She looked around the committee room, noting the senior officers who were listening intently. We need commanders who are uncomfortable with conventional wisdom, who ask difficult questions about official assessments, and who prepare for scenarios that everyone else considers unlikely. These traits are not correlated with experience or seniority. They're correlated with intellectual curiosity and willingness to challenge assumptions. After the hearing, Sarah was approached by Major General Patricia Williams, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. Colonel Chun, that was an impressive performance. Have you given thought to what assignment you would like next? Sarah had indeed given thought to her future, but her answer surprised the general. Ma'am, I would like to develop a training program for disaster response leadership. Not just tactical procedures, but decision-making frameworks for unprecedented situations. I want to teach other commanders how to prepare for events that have never happened before. 6 months later, Sarah was appointed director of the Military Leadership Institute's new crisis decision-making program. Her first class included 24 officers from all service branches, ranging from captains to full colonels. The curriculum she developed focused on intellectual humility, assumption challenging, and preparation for low-probability events. The program became known throughout the military as Mouse School, a reference to Sarah's old nickname that had become a badge of honor rather than an insult. Officers competed for admission to her program, recognizing that the quiet colonel who had been dismissed as inexperienced had revolutionized thinking about crisis leadership. But Sarah's most lasting impact came through the officers she trained. Over the following years, her students managed responses to earthquakes, terrorist attacks, pandemic outbreaks, and other unprecedented crises. They consistently outperformed more traditionally trained commanders because they had learned to prepare for the unexpected rather than relying on experience with previous events. 2 years after Patricia, Sarah received a call from Rebecca Martinez, the emergency management director who had worked with her during the hurricane. Rebecca had been promoted to head the Federal Emergency Management Agency and wanted Sarah's input on national disaster preparedness. Colonel, we are facing climate change scenarios that have no historical precedent, Rebecca explained. We need commanders who can prepare for disasters that have never happened before. People like you. Sarah smiled as she looked out her office window at a new class of officers beginning crisis decision-making training. Rebecca, I think we can do better than just people like me. I think we could train people to be better than me. The quiet commander who had been dismissed as inexperienced had proven something that military institutions were slowly beginning to understand. The most effective leaders in unprecedented situations are not necessarily those with the most experience, but those with the intellectual humility to question everything they think they know. Hurricane Patricia had lasted only 8 hours, but Its lessons about leadership, preparation, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom would influence military thinking for decades. Sarah Chun had proven them all wrong, not through strength or volume, but through careful analysis and the willingness to prepare for disasters that everyone else considered impossible. The storm had revealed who was truly ready to lead when everything fell apart at once. It was not the commander everyone expected. It was the one they had all underestimated.